There is a version of you that only exists when no one else is watching. You know the one. It's the version that dances in the kitchen without checking if the blinds are open. It's the version that laughs too loud at something genuinely funny, instead of measuring the laugh to make sure it looks right. It's the version that says what it actually thinks, instead of running the sentence through a filter first, adjusting it, softening it, cutting the parts that might make someone raise an eyebrow. That version of you is not a fantasy. It is not some idealized future self you have to work years to become. It is who you already are underneath the performance. The tragedy is that most people spend more hours of their life managing how they appear to others than they spend actually living. They rehearse conversations before they happen. They replay conversations after they happen, combing through every word for a mistake. They choose their clothes, their words, their opinions, even their dreams, based on a silent committee of people who are not in the room and who, most of the time, are not thinking about them at all. This book exists to dismantle that committee, not with empty affirmations, not with the hollow advice to simply not care, because if it were that easy, you would have done it already. This is about understanding exactly why your brain built this committee in the first place, what it is costing you every single day that it stays in charge, and how to systematically take your life back from an audience that was never really watching as closely as you believed. By the end of this, you will not just understand the mechanics of approval seeking. You will have a working method to interrupt it in real time. Rebuild your identity on a foundation that cannot be shaken by a stranger's opinion, and start making decisions from a place of internal authority instead of external permission. This is not about becoming careless or cold or indifferent to the people around you. It is about finally becoming free. Consider, for a moment, how strange it actually is that you have spent so much of your life being governed by an audience that cannot see inside your head, cannot feel what you feel, and in most cases, will never know the full weight of what you gave up to keep them comfortable. You have negotiated with people who never knew a negotiation was happening. You have lost arguments to opinions that were never spoken aloud because you conceded before the other person even opened their mouth, simply by imagining what they might say and adjusting yourself in advance. This is the strange mathematics of a life lived for others. The most powerful judge in the room is very often not a real person at all, but a projection, a composite character assembled from every disapproving glance you have ever collected, running in the background of your mind like software you never agreed to install. What makes this book different from a simple pep talk is that it refuses to pretend the fix is instant. Anyone who tells you that you can simply decide to stop caring, as though flipping a switch, is selling you a fantasy that will not survive first contact with real life. What actually works is slower, more deliberate, and far more durable, because it is built on understanding rather than willpower. Willpower fades. Understanding compounds. Every chapter that follows is designed to remove one more layer of the mechanism that keeps you performing, until what remains is not a hardened, indifferent version of you, but the original, unfiltered version that was always there, simply buried beneath years of careful management. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Ancient Alarm System Inside Your Brain. To understand why you care so much about what others think, you have to stop treating it as a personality flaw and start treating it as what it actually is, a survival mechanism that is thousands of years old. and running in a world it was never designed for. For most of human history, being rejected by your group was not an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. If the tribe cast you out, there was no apartment to move into, no other city to start over in, no way to hunt, gather, or defend yourself alone against predators and rival groups. Exclusion meant exposure, starvation, and often a swift end. So the brain developed an alarm system whose entire job was to monitor social standing constantly, scanning for any sign that you were falling out of favor, being judged, being laughed at, being talked about behind your back. Because in that ancestral environment, those signals were early warnings of a threat to your literal survival. This system did not evolve to make you happy. It evolved to keep you alive by keeping you liked, or at the very least, keeping you from being cast out. And the brain, being extraordinarily efficient at repurposing old machinery for new problems, never got the memo that the world changed. You are not going to be left to die in the wilderness because a coworker thinks your idea in the meeting was mediocre. Nobody is going to banish you from food and shelter because a stranger on the internet disagreed with your opinion. But your nervous system does not know that. It reacts to a raised eyebrow, a slow reply to a text message, a joke you're not sure was actually a joke, with the same ancient alarm that used to mean your life was in danger. This is why social rejection does not just hurt your feelings. It activates regions of the brain associated with actual physical pain. Researchers have found that the same neural pathways that light up when you stub your toe or burn your hand light up when you experience social exclusion. Your brain is not exaggerating when it tells you that being left out, being judged, being laughed at hurts. It genuinely does, at a neurological level, because your brain is treating it as a threat to your physical existence, not just your ego. Once you understand this, something remarkable happens. You stop being ashamed of caring what others think. Shame was never useful here anyway, because you cannot shame a survival instinct into disappearing. What you can do is recognize the alarm for what it is: an outdated system firing false positives constantly because it cannot tell the difference between a genuine existential threat and a stranger's passing opinion that will be forgotten in 11 seconds. Every time you feel that hot flash of anxiety before speaking up in a group, that is not weakness. That is tens of thousands of years of evolutionary programming trying to protect you from a danger that, in this specific instance, does not exist. The goal is not to silence the alarm completely. It will never fully go quiet. And trying to force it into silence will only create more internal conflict. The goal is to recognize when it is firing without cause and to consciously override it, the same way you would override a smoke detector that goes off every time you make toast. You do not disconnect the smoke detector entirely. You simply learn to distinguish a real fire from burnt bread. This distinction, once you can make it reliably, changes everything about how you move through the world. Because you stop reacting to every social signal as though your survival depends on it, and you start responding only to the ones that actually matter. There is another layer to this ancient wiring worth understanding, because it explains why the fear of judgment often feels disproportionate even to you, even as you're experiencing it. The brain's threat detection system, often centered around a small, almond-shaped structure called the amygdala, does not wait for conscious analysis before it reacts. It fires first, and thinking follows a fraction of a second later. This means that by the time your rational mind has a chance to evaluate whether a social situation is actually dangerous, your body has already flooded itself with stress hormones, already tightened your chest, already quickened your pulse, already prepared you to freeze, flee, or appease, all in response to something as minor as an unanswered message or a coworker's neutral expression. You are not failing to think clearly in these moments. You are experiencing a biological process that evolved to prioritize speed over accuracy. Because in the ancestral environment, a fast, wrong guess about danger was survivable, but a slow, correct one often was not. The cost of this system today is that it produces constant false alarms in a world that is, for the vast majority of us, far safer socially than it has ever been in human history. No one is going to exile you into the wilderness because you gave an unpopular opinion at dinner. And yet the body responds as though they might, because the wiring has not caught up to the world it now lives in. Understanding this gap between ancient wiring and modern reality is not a minor intellectual exercise. It is the foundation everything else in this book is built on. Because you cannot successfully override a system you do not understand. You can spend years trying to talk yourself out of anxiety with surface-level logic, telling yourself repeatedly that it doesn't matter what people think, and find that the anxiety returns anyway, because you are arguing with the wrong part of your brain. The part that generates this fear is not persuaded by logic in the way your conscious mind is. It responds to repeated evidence, to lived experience that contradicts the alarm, to your nervous system slowly learning, through repetition, that the feared outcome does not actually threaten your survival. This is why the chapters ahead will not simply tell you to think differently. They will show you how to build new evidence, deliberately and repeatedly, until your ancient alarm system finally updates its model of what is actually dangerous in your life today. Chapter 2. The Hidden Price. You have been paying. Most people never total up the actual cost of living for an audience, because the payments are made quietly, in small denominations, spread out over years, so gradually that the loss never registers as a single dramatic event. It is not one catastrophic moment where you lose yourself. It is 1,000 tiny surrenders. It is the career you didn't pursue because your family expected something more conventional. It is the opinion you didn't voice in the meeting because you were afraid of how it would land. It is the art you never shared, the business you never started, the person you never told how you really felt, the version of your personality you kept dialed down, because the full volume of who you are felt like too much for the room. Each of these moments feels small in isolation. That is exactly what makes this so dangerous. If living for others cost you everything all at once, you would notice immediately and fight back. Instead, it costs you in installments so minor that you rationalize each one individually. You tell yourself it's not the right time to say what you think. You tell yourself you'll pursue the real dream later, once things are more stable, once people would understand, once the timing is better. But the timing never magically becomes better, because the underlying pattern hasn't changed. You are still filtering your one and only life through the imagined judgment of people who, statistically, are not spending nearly as much time thinking about you as you assume. Consider what this actually adds up to over a decade. A decade of softened opinions is a decade of never fully knowing what you actually think. because you never let the thought complete itself without immediately asking whether it's acceptable. A decade of a muted personality is a decade of relationships built on a partial version of you, which means the people around you have never truly met you, and the connection you have with them, however real it feels, is built on a foundation that is not fully honest. A decade of chasing approval is a decade where your sense of worth was never actually yours. It was on loan, issued and revoked by whoever happened to be in the room, which means you spent 10 years with no stable ground to stand on at all. This is the part that should genuinely alarm you. Approval is not a stable currency. It fluctuates by the day, by the person, by their mood, by factors that have nothing to do with you and everything to do with their own internal world. If your sense of self-worth is built on approval, you have built your entire foundation on the single most unstable material available. You are constructing your identity on sand and wondering why you feel like you're constantly sinking. And here is the deeper cost, the one that is easiest to miss, because it doesn't announce itself with pain the way rejection does. It is the slow erosion of your relationship with your own instincts. Every time you override what you actually want in favor of what will be well received, you are teaching your own brain that your instincts cannot be trusted, that they need to be checked and approved by an external authority before they are allowed to become action. Do this enough times, for enough years, and you lose the ability to even identify what you want anymore, because the muscle that used to sense it has atrophied from disuse. People in this state often describe feeling numb, directionless, unsure of their own preferences, even in small things like what to order at a restaurant or what to do with a free afternoon. This is not a personality trait. It is the long-term consequence of a life spent outsourcing your decisions to an imagined jury. The good news, and this is worth sitting with, is that none of this damage is permanent. The instinct can be rebuilt. The muscle can be retrained. But it starts with an honest accounting of exactly what the habit of caring too much has already cost you. Because you cannot fix a problem you have not fully priced. There is a particular kind of grief that surfaces when people finally do this accounting honestly. And it is worth naming, because if you feel it while reading this, it does not mean something is wrong with you. It means the accounting is working. This grief is not for a version of yourself that died. It is for a version of yourself that was never allowed to fully live. And mourning that version is an important and necessary step, not something to rush past. Many people, when they first confront how much of their life has been shaped by an audience rather than by their own authentic preferences, feel a wave of anger before the grief. Anger at the years spent optimizing for approval instead of fulfillment. Anger at how convincing the pattern was. How invisible it managed to stay for so long while quietly steering every major decision. Let that anger move through you if it comes. It is useful fuel, as long as you don't let it curdle into self-blame. Because the goal here is not to punish yourself for the years already spent living this way. You were doing the best you could with a nervous system that was, as the previous chapter explained, simply running an outdated survival program. The point of the accounting is not self-punishment. It is clarity. And clarity is the prerequisite for change. Consider also the compounding effect this pattern has on your relationships specifically, because it doesn't just cost you personally, it costs the people who actually care about you the chance to know who you really are. When you consistently present an edited, approval-optimized version of yourself, even the people closest to you, the ones who would love the unfiltered version just as much or more, never get access to it. They fall in love with, become friends with. Build a life alongside, a curated performance. And on some level, you know this, which creates its own quiet loneliness, even inside relationships that look successful from the outside. This is one of the cruelest ironies of living for approval. The very connection you were trying to protect by managing how you're perceived is the thing that ends up shallower and less secure, because it was never built on the full truth of who you are to begin with. Real intimacy, the kind that actually makes people feel less alone in the world, requires being seen, not performed for. And performance, no matter how well received, cannot manufacture that feeling no matter how long you sustain it. Chapter 3. The spotlight that was never actually on. There is a well-documented psychological phenomenon called the spotlight effect. And once you understand it, you will never think about social anxiety the same way again. The spotlight effect describes the near-universal tendency to dramatically overestimate how much other people notice and remember about you. In study after study, researchers have found the same pattern. People are convinced others are scrutinizing their appearance, their mistakes, their awkward comment from earlier in the day, when in reality, the people around them noticed a fraction of what they assumed, and ovri hell to ben, and forgot even that fraction almost immediately. In one well-known experiment, participants were asked to wear an embarrassing t-shirt into a room of strangers and then estimate what percentage of people in the room noticed the shirt. The participants consistently guessed a number nearly double the actual percentage who recalled anything about it. The people wearing the shirt were living inside an imagined spotlight, so intense they could barely think about anything else, while the people around them were, unsurprisingly, mostly thinking about themselves. This is the part that is difficult to accept, not because it's complicated, but because it is humbling in a very specific way. You are convinced you are the main character in everyone else's story, when in truth, everyone else is the main character in their own story. And you are at best a supporting extra who appears for a scene or two and is quickly forgotten as their own concerns take center stage again. This is not an insult. It is liberation disguised as a hard truth. Think about your own life for a moment. Think about how much time you spend thinking about other people's minor mistakes, their outfit choices, the thing they said that was slightly awkward 3 weeks ago. If you're honest, the answer is almost none. You were far too consumed with your own thoughts, your own worries, your own version of the spotlight effect running in your own head, to spend meaningful time cataloging someone else's flaws. Everyone is doing this simultaneously, all the time, which means the audience you are so terrified of disappointing is, in reality, an audience of people who are each individually convinced that they themselves are being watched and judged, and who therefore have almost no bandwidth left to actually watch and judge you. The spotlight you feel burning down on you is not coming from outside. It is coming from inside your own head, and you are both the person holding the light and the person standing beneath it, exhausting yourself in a performance for a crowd that has already turned around to worry about their own reflection. This does not mean no one is ever watching, or that actions have no social consequences. It means the intensity of scrutiny you imagine is almost always wildly inflated compared to the scrutiny that actually exists. And once you can see that gap clearly between the imagined audience and the real one, the fear starts to lose its grip because you are no longer bracing yourself against a threat of that magnitude. You are recalibrating to the actual, much smaller, much less permanent, much less invested audience that is really out there. The next time you feel that flush of anxiety over how something you said or did will be perceived, ask yourself a simple question. In 2 weeks, will the people who witnessed this still remember it? Or will they be consumed with their own version of this exact same fear, running on a loop in their own mind about something you have already forgotten? The answer, almost every time, tells you everything you need to know about how much power you have been handing over to an audience that was never really watching in the first place. It helps to understand why the spotlight effect exists at all. Because, like the ancient alarm system discussed earlier, it is not a random glitch. It is a natural byproduct of how human cognition works. You experience the world entirely from your own vantage point, every single second of every day, with no exception, ever. You have never once experienced life from inside someone else's perspective. This means your own thoughts, your own appearance, your own mistakes are always the loudest, most immediate, most vivid data available to you, simply because you are the one generating and experiencing them directly. Other people's inner experience, by contrast, is invisible to you, which makes it very easy to unconsciously assume that your own prominence in your own mind must be matched by an equal prominence in everyone else's mind. But it isn't, because they are having the exact same experience you are, just centered on themselves instead of on you. This is not a flaw in your character. It is simply what it feels like to be a conscious being who only ever has direct access to one mind. Once you internalize this, you can start applying it practically. The next time you're agonizing over how a comment you made will be perceived, try to remember, honestly, the last 5 things a friend or colleague said or did that you personally judged and are still actively thinking about today. For most people, this list is remarkably short, often empty, because you, too, are living inside your own spotlight effect, too consumed with your own performance to maintain a long-running catalogue of everyone else's minor missteps. This exercise is worth returning to often, because it is one of the fastest ways to shrink the imagined audience back down to its real size. There is also a longer-term version of this same insight that deserves attention, because it applies not just to a single embarrassing moment, but to your reputation as a whole, the sum total of how you believe you are perceived over months and years. Most people wildly overestimate how much space they occupy in other people's ongoing narrative. You are, in the story, any given person is telling themselves about their own life, a minor character at best, appearing occasionally, mentioned in passing, rarely, if ever, the subject of sustained thought. This is true even of people who seem to think about you constantly, because their thinking, however frequent, is still filtered entirely through their own concerns, their own insecurities, their own agenda, which means even their judgment of you says far more about them than it ever says about you. Chapter 4. Where this pattern was first written into you. No one is born checking every action against an internal approval meter. This is a learned behavior. And like most learned behaviors, its roots trace back further than most people are willing to look, usually into childhood, into the earliest relationships where you first discovered that love, attention, and safety were not unconditional, but contingent on behaving in certain ways. Think about how a child learns what earns affection and what earns disapproval. A child who is praised only when they achieve, only when they are quiet and convenient, only when they align with what a parent or caregiver wants, learns a lesson far more powerful than anything explicitly said. The lesson is this: my worth is not inherent. My worth is something I have to earn, continuously, through performance that satisfies someone else. This lesson, absorbed at an age before you had the cognitive tools to question it, becomes the operating system underneath everything else. It doesn't stay confined to childhood. It follows you into friendships, where you become the version of yourself that keeps the peace and avoids conflict, even at the cost of your own needs. It follows you into romantic relationships, where you shape yourself around what you believe the other person wants, sometimes losing track of what you actually want in the process. It follows you into your career, where you chase titles, salaries, and recognition not necessarily because they align with what fulfills you, but because they are legible markers of success that will earn approval from people whose opinion you internalized decades ago and never questioned since. This is important to understand clearly. The committee inside your head, the one you consult before every decision, was not built by you. It was built, piece by piece, by the reactions and expectations of people from your past, some of whom may not even be a meaningful part of your life anymore, and yet their voice remains installed in your decision-making process as though they are still standing right beside you, watching, evaluating, ready to withdraw approval the moment you step out of line. Understanding the origin of this pattern is not about assigning blame. Most of the people who shaped this in you were themselves shaped the same way, passing down a pattern of conditional worth that likely stretches back generations, each person doing their imperfect best with the tools they had. The point of tracing it back is not to build resentment. It is to see the pattern clearly enough to recognize that it was installed, not innate, which means it can be examined, challenged, and ultimately replaced. Here is the question that starts to loosen its grip. Whose voice is actually running the committee in your head right now? When you hesitate before speaking your mind, whose disapproval are you actually afraid of? Very often, when people genuinely sit with this question instead of rushing past it, they discover the voice belongs to someone specific: a parent, a former friend, an old authority figure, someone whose actual opinion of them today may not even matter anymore. And yet, the internalized version of that voice still holds a vote, still gets consulted, still shapes decisions being made decades later. Once you can name the voice, you take away its disguise. It stops masquerading as your own intuition and reveals itself as what it actually is: an old recording, playing on a loop, long after the person who made it has lost any real authority over your life. You cannot silence a voice you refuse to identify. But once identified, once you can say clearly, "This is not my judgment. This is an inherited fear from a specific moment in my past," you gain the one thing that pattern has always depended on you not having: distance. This process of tracing the pattern back to its origin often surfaces a specific category of memory worth paying close attention to. The moments when you first learned that being fully yourself carried a cost. Maybe it was a time you expressed genuine excitement about something and were met with dismissal instead of shared enthusiasm. Maybe it was a moment of honesty that resulted in punishment rather than understanding. Maybe it was simply years of subtle signals. A raised eyebrow here, a disappointed sigh there. None of them dramatic enough to qualify as a single defining event, but cumulatively powerful enough to teach you that the safest strategy was to read the room first and adjust yourself accordingly before ever showing your full hand. These moments, whether singular and sharp or gradual and diffuse, become the template your brain uses going forward, a kind of internal case study. It references every time a new situation resembles the original one closely enough. This is also why certain specific contexts trigger the fear of judgment far more intensely than others. If your original conditioning happened primarily around achievement, you may find that professional settings trigger the most intense fear of being judged, while your personal relationships feel comparatively safe. If your conditioning happened primarily around emotional expression, you may find the opposite, where showing feelings publicly feels riskier than sharing an unpopular opinion at work. Identifying your specific pattern, rather than treating the fear as one uniform blob, allows you to target your energy far more precisely, because the exit strategy for achievement-based conditioning looks different from the exit strategy for emotional expression-based conditioning, even though both stem from the same underlying mechanism of conditional worth. It is also worth acknowledging, honestly, that some of the people who installed this pattern in you may still be present in your life today, which complicates the process considerably because you are not simply dealing with a memory, you are potentially still navigating an active relationship with the source of the original conditioning. This does not mean the work is impossible. It means the work requires an additional layer of boundary setting, a conscious decision to interact with that person today as who they actually are now, rather than reflexively surrendering to the authority they held over you as a child. An authority that, if you look honestly at your life today, they may no longer actually possess at all, except for the power you continue, out of habit, to hand back to them. Chapter 5. The 3 traps that keep you performing. Once the pattern is installed, it does not maintain itself through one single mechanism. It maintains itself through several interlocking traps, each one reinforcing the others, creating a loop that feels less like a choice and more like an inescapable current. Understanding these traps individually is the first step toward finally breaking free of the current altogether. The first is the approval loop. This is the most obvious of the 3, and it works exactly as it sounds. You take an action. You receive a positive reaction, whether that's a compliment, a like, a smile, a moment of validation, and your brain registers that reaction as a reward. Rewards get repeated. So the next time you're deciding how to act, what to say, what to wear, what opinion to share, you unconsciously reach for whatever previously generated approval rather than what genuinely reflects who you are in this moment. Over time, this loop does not just influence your behavior, it starts to overwrite your actual preferences because you have been trained so thoroughly to chase the reaction that you lose track of what you would have chosen without it. The danger of the approval loop is that it never actually satisfies you permanently. Each hit of approval is temporary, which means the loop demands to be fed again and again, an endless chase after a feeling that by design can never accumulate into lasting security because it was never coming from a stable source in the first place. The second trap is the comparison trap. This one operates by constantly measuring your life, your choices, your appearance, your achievements, against other people, using their apparent success or apparent approval as the yardstick for whether you are doing enough, being enough, living correctly. The comparison trap is particularly vicious because it never runs out of new targets. In previous generations, comparison was limited to your immediate community, the people you actually encountered in daily life. Now, comparison operates against a nearly infinite pool of curated highlight reels, filtered images, and selectively presented lives, which means no matter how well your actual life is going, there is always another data point available to make you feel behind, less than, or somehow doing it wrong. The comparison trap keeps you performing for an audience because it convinces you that your value is relative rather than inherent, that you must constantly benchmark yourself against others to know whether you are acceptable, which guarantees you will never feel settled, because the benchmark is infinite and always shifting. The third trap is the silence trap. This is the quietest of the three, and often the most corrosive, because unlike the other two, it doesn't reward action, it rewards inaction. The silence trap convinces you that not saying what you think, not sharing what you made, not asking for what you want, not correcting a misunderstanding is safer than the alternative, because if you never put yourself forward, you can never be rejected. This feels protective in the moment. It is, in fact, the most expensive trap of the three, because every time you choose silence over expression, you are trading a small, temporary discomfort for a much larger, permanent loss, the loss of the opportunity itself. The idea you never shared could have changed something. The feelings you never expressed could have deepened a relationship, or, just as usefully, revealed that the relationship needed to end. The request you never made could have been granted. Silence feels safe because it avoids visible failure, but it guarantees an invisible one. The failure of a life that never fully happened because you were too busy protecting yourself from an audience that, as you now understand, was barely paying attention to begin with. These three traps, the approval loop, the comparison trap, and the silence trap, do not operate in isolation. They feed each other in a continuous cycle. The comparison trap tells you that you are behind. The approval loop tells you the fix is to perform harder for validation. The silence trap tells you that the safest response to both is to shrink, to hold back, to wait. Around and around it goes. And the entire time, you are convinced this is simply who you are. An anxious person, a people pleaser, someone who just happens to care a lot about what others think, when in reality you are caught inside a mechanical loop that was built piece by piece and can, with the same deliberateness, be dismantled piece by piece. Recognizing which of these three traps has the strongest grip on you personally is the first practical step, because the exit strategy for each one is slightly different, and that is exactly where we are headed next. Take a moment to actually reflect on your own life through the lens of these three traps, rather than moving past them abstractly. Think about the last major decision you made, whether it was about your career, a relationship, or something as small as how you spent a weekend. Was that decision shaped primarily by what genuinely felt right to you? Or can you trace its shape back to one of these three mechanisms operating quietly underneath your reasoning? Most people, when they do this honestly for the first time, are startled by how many of their supposedly independent choices trace back to one of these traps rather than to an authentic internal preference. This is not a reason for despair. It is, in fact, enormously useful information. Because a pattern you can name is a pattern you can begin to interrupt, whereas a pattern that operates invisibly will simply keep running indefinitely, dictating your choices, while you remain convinced they were entirely your own. It is also worth noting that these traps rarely announce themselves with the word fear. They disguise themselves as reasonableness, as practicality, as maturity. The approval loop disguises itself as simply being a considerate, likable person. The comparison trap disguises itself as ambition, as healthy motivation to keep improving. The silence trap disguises itself as patience, as not wanting to make a scene, as waiting for the right moment. Learning to see through these disguises is a skill. And, like any skill, it improves with deliberate practice. Every time you notice yourself making a choice and can ask honestly whether this decision is coming from genuine preference or from one of these three mechanisms in costume, you strengthen your ability to catch the pattern earlier and earlier in the process, until eventually you can interrupt it before it even fully forms. Rather than only recognizing it in hindsight after the decision has already been made and the moment has already passed. This is the real work ahead. Not simply understanding these traps intellectually, which you now do, but training yourself to notice them operating in real time, in the actual texture of your daily decisions, so that awareness stops being a one-time insight and becomes an active, ongoing practice. Chapter 6. What confidence actually is. Most people carry around a badly mistaken definition of confidence, and this mistake alone keeps them stuck for years, chasing a version of self-assurance that was never real to begin with. The common assumption is that confidence means the absence of fear, that a confident person walks into a room feeling nothing but calm certainty, immune to the possibility of judgment, untouched by the ancient alarm system described earlier in this book. This definition is not just inaccurate, it is actively harmful, because it sets an impossible standard. If you believe confidence requires the total absence of fear, then every time you feel that familiar flicker of anxiety before speaking up, before sharing your work, before being fully yourself in front of others, you will interpret that flicker as proof that you are not confident, that you have failed before you have even started. This creates a vicious cycle where the presence of a completely normal human emotion becomes evidence of personal inadequacy, which only intensifies the very anxiety you were trying to overcome. The actual definition of confidence, the one that holds up under real scrutiny, is entirely different. Confidence is not the absence of fear. Confidence is the willingness to act in alignment with your values and your authentic preferences, even while fear is present. It is not a feeling you wait to arrive before taking action. It is a decision you make in spite of a feeling that may never fully go away. This distinction changes everything about how you approach the work ahead, because it means you do not need to eliminate the ancient alarm system, the spotlight effect, or the inherited voices from your past before you can start living differently. You simply need to stop waiting for their permission. Every person you have ever admired for their apparent confidence, every public figure, every leader, every artist who seems to move through the world, unbothered by judgment, still experiences some version of that same internal alarm. The difference is not that their alarm is quieter. The difference is that they have practiced repeatedly the specific skill of acting anyway. of treating the fear as background noise rather than as a stop sign. This is genuinely good news, because it means confidence is not a fixed trait that some people are born with and others are permanently excluded from. It is a skill built through repetition, the same way any other skill is built, through deliberate practice, performed slightly outside your comfort zone, over and over, until the nervous system slowly updates its model of what is actually dangerous. There is a second common misunderstanding about confidence worth addressing directly, which is the belief that confidence must be validated externally before it can be considered real. Under this flawed model, you are only allowed to feel confident about something once other people have confirmed it is deserved. Once you have received enough praise, enough success, enough proof that your instincts were correct. This model guarantees you will always feel one achievement behind actual confidence. Because the moment you receive external validation for one thing, the goalposts move to the next uncertain territory, and the requirement for proof resets all over again. Genuine confidence works in the opposite direction. It does not wait for external proof. It generates its own internal proof through the simple, repeated act of following through on your own judgment, regardless of whether anyone else witnessed it or approved of it. Every time you make a decision based on your own authentic assessment of a situation, rather than on an attempt to predict and satisfy an imagined audience, and then follow through on that decision, you are making a small deposit into an internal account of self-trust. This account does not depend on outcomes being universally praised. It depends only on the consistency between what you decided and what you actually did. Over time, this account compounds exactly the way any of the compounding principles from your other work on discipline and consistency compound, until you reach a point where your relationship with your own judgment is strong enough that outside approval becomes a pleasant addition rather than a required ingredient. This is the actual mechanism behind what people call self-confidence. It is not a personality trait some people simply have. It is the accumulated result of thousands of small moments where a person chose to trust and act on their own assessment instead of outsourcing that assessment to someone else, and then watched, again and again, as the world did not end. It is worth pausing here to address a common objection that arises at exactly this point in the process. Because if it is left unaddressed, it can quietly sabotage everything discussed so far. The objection usually sounds something like this: if I stop caring what others think, won't I become arrogant, inconsiderate, or blind to legitimate feedback about my own blind spots? This is a reasonable concern, and it deserves a direct answer rather than a dismissal. The confidence being described in this chapter is not the same thing as arrogance, and the difference between the two is not subtle once you understand it clearly. Arrogance is actually a close cousin of approval seeking, not its opposite. Because arrogance still requires an audience. It simply requires that audience to be impressed rather than merely accepting. A person acting from arrogance is still deeply invested in how they are perceived. They have simply flipped the desired outcome from approval to admiration, but the underlying dependency on external perception remains fully intact. True confidence, the kind built on internal values rather than external validation, does not need anyone to be impressed. It does not need anyone to agree. It simply needs alignment between your actions and your own honest assessment of what matters, which means a genuinely confident person can hear criticism, sit with disagreement, and even be wrong about something without any of it threatening their underlying sense of worth, because that worth was never dependent on being right or being admired in the first place. This is precisely why confidence built this way makes you more capable of hearing real feedback, not less, because you are no longer filtering every piece of input through the lens of whether it threatens your fragile self-image. You can simply evaluate whether the feedback is accurate and useful, and act on it if it is, without the entire process being clouded by defensiveness. Chapter 7. The Daily Practices that Rebuild Your Instincts. Understanding the mechanics behind approval seeking is necessary, but understanding alone will not change your life if it stays purely theoretical. What actually creates transformation is deliberate, repeated practice, small actions performed consistently until your nervous system gathers enough new evidence to update its old programming. The first practice worth building into your daily life is what can be called the pause and check. Every time you notice yourself about to modify a genuine preference, an honest opinion, or an authentic reaction, in order to make it more palatable to an imagined audience, pause for a single breath and ask yourself a direct question. Am I about to say or do this because it reflects what I actually think, or because I am predicting and managing someone else's reaction before they have even had the chance to have one? This single pause, repeated consistently, begins to interrupt the automatic nature of the approval loop, because you cannot change a pattern you are not consciously aware of in the moment it is happening. At first, this pause will feel effortful and slow. That effort is not a sign you are doing it wrong. It is a sign you are building a new neural pathway. And new pathways always feel effortful before they become automatic. The same way any new skill, whether a language or a physical movement, feels clumsy and deliberate before it becomes fluent and unconscious. It helps to have a concrete way of tracking this pause and check practice, because vague intentions rarely survive contact with a busy, distracted day. Some people find it useful to keep a simple running count, even just a tally on a phone or a scrap of paper, of every time they catch themselves mid-modification and choose the authentic option instead. This is not about achieving a perfect score. It is about making the invisible visible, turning an automatic, unconscious process into something you can actually observe and measure over time. Watching that number grow across a week, then a month, provides its own quiet form of encouragement, tangible proof that the pattern is genuinely shifting, even on days when the shift doesn't feel especially dramatic from the inside. The second practice is deliberate, small exposure, sometimes described as social courage repetitions. This involves intentionally choosing, on a regular basis, to do something mildly uncomfortable that involves the possibility of judgment, specifically in order to teach your nervous system that the feared outcome either does not happen or, if it does happen, does not actually damage you the way the alarm predicted. This does not require dramatic gestures. It can be as simple as voicing a genuine opinion in a conversation where you would normally stay quiet, wearing something you like, regardless of whether it matches current trends, asking a question in a group setting instead of assuming it's a foolish question not worth raising, or telling someone directly what you appreciate about them, instead of keeping the thought private out of a vague fear of seeming strange. Each of these small repetitions functions as a data point for your nervous system, evidence that contradicts the ancient alarm's prediction of catastrophe. The key to this practice is consistency over intensity. One dramatic act of vulnerability will not retrain years of conditioning. Dozens of small, repeated acts will. because the nervous system responds to patterns of evidence accumulated over time, not to single, isolated incidents, however meaningful they may feel in the moment. The third practice is learning to sit with disapproval when it does happen, rather than immediately trying to fix, explain, or retreat from it. This is perhaps the most important practice of all, because ultimately you cannot control whether someone disapproves of a choice you make, an opinion you hold, or a version of yourself you present. What you can control is your relationship to that disapproval once it occurs. Most people, when they encounter even mild disapproval, rush immediately into damage control, over-explaining themselves, softening their position, apologizing for something that did not require an apology, all in an attempt to restore the approval as quickly as possible. This rush to repair actually reinforces the underlying belief that disapproval is dangerous and must be eliminated immediately. The alternative practice, uncomfortable as it initially feels, is to allow disapproval to exist without immediately trying to fix it. Let someone disagree with you without rushing to convince them otherwise. Let someone be unimpressed by a choice you made without explaining yourself into a justification you don't actually owe them. This does not mean becoming rude or dismissive of others' genuine concerns. It means developing tolerance for the simple, survivable reality that not everyone will approve of everything you do, and that this fact, once you have enough repeated exposure to it, stops feeling like a crisis and starts feeling like an unremarkable, ordinary part of being a person with your own distinct preferences, moving through a world full of other people with their own distinct preferences. There is a useful mental reframe that supports this particular practice, one worth carrying with you into moments where disapproval actually arises. Instead of interpreting someone's disapproval as a problem to be solved, try interpreting it as simply additional information about a difference between two people. Nothing more urgent or catastrophic than that. Two people can hold different opinions, different tastes, different assessments of a situation, without either one being wrong, and without the disagreement requiring resolution before either person can move forward comfortably. This reframe strips disapproval of the emergency quality it often carries when the ancient alarm system is running the show, and replaces it with something closer to its actual, much smaller scale. A simple divergence of perspective, the kind that happens constantly between any two people who are genuinely distinct individuals with genuinely distinct inner lives. The more you practice sitting inside this reframe, the less each individual instance of disapproval demands from you, and the faster you are able to return your attention to what actually matters, your own values, your own next action, rather than remaining stuck trying to close a gap between your perspective and someone else's that may never fully close and does not actually need to. The fourth and final practice worth building is a regular habit of identity journaling, a consistent practice of writing down, privately, what you actually think, feel, and want, completely separate from any consideration of how it would be received if shared. This practice matters because, as discussed earlier, years of approval seeking can erode your ability to even identify your own authentic preferences, having spent so long filtering every thought through an external lens that the original, unfiltered thought becomes harder to locate. Regularly writing without an audience, even an imagined one, without editing for how it sounds, without softening conclusions, to make them more acceptable, rebuilds the muscle of accessing your own honest perspective. Over time, this practice becomes a private laboratory where you can reconnect with what you actually believe, want, and value, independent of what would be well received, which then makes it significantly easier to bring that same honesty into your actual lived public life. These 4 practices, the pause and check, deliberate small exposure, sitting with disapproval, and identity journaling, work best when treated not as a checklist to complete once, but as an ongoing rotation, woven into the actual texture of your daily life, rather than confined to a single session of self-improvement. It is worth being realistic about the timeline here as well, because unrealistic expectations about speed are one of the most common reasons people abandon this kind of work prematurely. The nervous system that built these patterns over years, sometimes decades, will not fully rewire itself in a matter of days or even weeks. Meaningful, durable change through practices like these typically unfolds over months, sometimes longer, with progress that rarely feels linear. There will be days where the old fear feels completely gone, replaced by a sense of ease and authenticity that feels almost effortless. And there will be other days, sometimes triggered by nothing you can immediately identify, where the old alarm reasserts itself with surprising intensity, and you find yourself right back in the familiar pattern of managing, softening, performing. This is not evidence that the work has failed. It is simply the actual, non-linear shape that this kind of change takes in every person who has ever successfully gone through it. The measure of progress is not the complete absence of old patterns showing up occasionally. The measure of progress is the growing frequency with which you catch the pattern, the shrinking gap between falling into old behavior and noticing it, and the increasing speed with which you can redirect yourself back toward alignment with your actual values once you do notice. Track that trajectory rather than expecting a permanent, flawless transformation, and you will find the process far more sustainable and far less discouraging than if you had set the bar at total, uninterrupted mastery. Chapter 8. Building an identity that cannot be shaken. Everything discussed so far has been about dismantling the old pattern, understanding where it came from, recognizing the traps that sustain it, and building new evidence through repeated practice. But dismantling an old structure is only half the work. If you tear down the foundation of approval-based worth without building something to replace it, you risk leaving yourself in a kind of directionless void, technically free from the old pattern but with nothing solid to stand on instead. This is why the next essential step is deliberately constructing an identity rooted in something more stable than external validation. An identity built on your own defined values, so that when judgment comes, and it will come, because it is an unavoidable part of existing among other people, you have something firm to stand on that does not shift depending on who is in the room. Building this kind of stable identity starts with clearly identifying your own core values, not the values you have absorbed from others, not the values that would look impressive if listed on a resume or a social media profile, but the values that genuinely matter to you when no one else is watching or grading the answer. This requires honest reflection, often uncomfortable, because it means separating what you actually believe from what you have simply inherited without ever fully examining. Ask yourself what you would still care about, still pursue, still consider important, even if you knew with absolute certainty that no one would ever find out, praise you for it, or judge you for it either way. The answers that survive this filter, the things you would still want even in complete anonymity, are much closer to your authentic values than anything shaped primarily by a desire to be seen a certain way. Once you have identified these core values, whether that's honesty, creativity, growth, connection, contribution, or whatever genuinely resonates for you personally, the next step is using them as your primary internal compass for decision-making, rather than defaulting to the question of how a choice will be perceived. This is a fundamental shift in the basic architecture of how you make decisions. Instead of asking, "What will people think?" the governing question becomes, "Does this align with what I actually value?" This single substitution, practiced consistently, gradually rebuilds your entire decision-making process on a foundation that cannot be destabilized by any single person's opinion, because your compass is no longer pointing toward an external, ever-shifting audience. It is pointing towards something internal and consistent, something that remains stable regardless of who happens to be watching on any given day. An identity built this way also changes your relationship to failure and rejection in a profound way. Because failure and rejection stop being verdicts on your worth and start being simply information about outcomes. If your sense of self depends on approval, then any rejection or criticism becomes an existential threat, evidence that you are fundamentally inadequate. But if your sense of self is anchored in your own values, then a rejected idea, a critical review, a relationship that doesn't work out, becomes something entirely different. It becomes data about a specific outcome in a specific situation. Unpleasant, perhaps, disappointing, perhaps, but not a referendum on your fundamental worth as a person. This reframe alone removes an enormous amount of the emotional weight that keeps people trapped in approval-seeking behavior, because so much of that behavior exists specifically to avoid a form of pain that, once your identity is properly anchored, simply no longer carries the same threat it once did. It's also worth understanding that building a values-based identity does not mean becoming rigid or closed off to feedback. There is an important difference between seeking approval and being open to genuine, constructive input from people you respect. A person with a stable, values-based identity can still hear criticism, consider it honestly, and even change their mind or their approach when the criticism is valid, without that process threatening their fundamental sense of self. The difference is that this kind of person is evaluating the feedback against their own values and their own judgment, deciding for themselves whether it has merit, rather than automatically absorbing every piece of external input as an unquestionable verdict, simply because it came from outside. This is the real difference between a person who has become defensively closed off and a person who has become genuinely secure. Security allows you to remain open, precisely because you are no longer afraid that openness will destroy you. There is a practical exercise worth building into this identity work, something that goes beyond simply identifying your values in the abstract and moves toward actually testing them against real decisions. Take a recent choice you made, primarily out of a desire to avoid judgment, something you softened, avoided, or agreed to, despite genuine reservations. Now run that same decision through your values instead, and ask honestly what you would have done if the only consideration had been alignment with what actually matters to you. Often, the gap between what you actually did And what your values would have suggested is where the real work lives, because it reveals exactly how much ground the old approval-based pattern still holds in your day-to-day decision-making. This is not an exercise designed to generate guilt about past choices. It is designed to build a clearer, more concrete map of where the transition from external to internal authority still needs deliberate attention. It is also worth recognizing that a values-based identity does not mean you will never again feel the pull of wanting approval. That pull is, as established earlier, wired deeply into your biology, and it would be unrealistic to expect it to disappear entirely simply because you now understand its mechanics. What changes is not the presence of the pull, but the amount of authority you grant it. A person with a strong, values-based identity still notices the desire for approval when it arises. They simply no longer treat that desire as the deciding vote in how they act. This distinction between noticing a feeling and being governed by it is really the entire practical outcome this book has been building toward from its very first page, and it is worth returning to often as you continue this work well beyond the final chapter. Chapter 9. What happens when you finally stop asking permission? There comes a point in this process, often gradual rather than sudden, where something shifts noticeably in how you move through your days. It rarely announces itself as a single dramatic transformation. More often, it arrives as a quiet accumulation of small moments where you notice yourself doing something you would never have done a year earlier. Speaking honestly in a conversation you would have previously navigated with careful diplomacy designed purely to avoid disapproval, wearing or saying or pursuing something simply because it is genuinely yours, without first running it through the old committee for approval. The first thing most people report noticing, once this shift begins to take hold, is an almost disorienting increase in available mental energy. It is difficult to fully appreciate until you experience the absence of it, just how much cognitive and emotional bandwidth is consumed by constant social monitoring, by the endless background process of predicting reactions, managing impressions, and rehearsing justifications for choices that never actually required justification in the first place. When that background process finally quiets down, even partially, the freed-up capacity is often redirected, sometimes without conscious effort, toward things that actually matter, toward creative work, toward deeper presence in relationships, toward pursuing goals that reflect genuine interest rather than a desire to look accomplished. People frequently describe this as feeling like they can finally think clearly for what feels like the first time in years, not because their intelligence changed, but because an enormous amount of processing power that was previously devoted to an invisible, unpaid job managing an imagined audience has been returned to its rightful owner. The second shift people notice is a change in the quality of their relationships. And this often surprises people who worried that caring less about others' opinions would somehow make them worse at connecting with people. The opposite tends to happen. When you stop performing an approval-optimized version of yourself and start showing up as your actual self, the relationships that survive this transition deepen considerably because they are now built on an accurate picture of who you are rather than a curated one. Some relationships, it's worth being honest about this, do not survive the transition, and this can initially feel like a loss, but it is more accurately understood as a clarification. Relationships that were only sustainable because you were suppressing parts of yourself were never as solid as they appeared, and their ending, while sometimes painful, removes a source of chronic, low-grade exhaustion that came from constantly managing yourself around someone who was never actually connecting with the real you to begin with. Meanwhile, the relationships that do survive, and the new ones that form once you are operating from this more authentic place, tend to feel fundamentally different, more relaxed, more genuinely intimate, because both people are finally interacting with reality instead of a performance. The third, and perhaps most significant shift, is the compounding effect this has on your actual life trajectory over time. Every decision you make from a place of authentic values rather than approval-seeking moves you incrementally closer to a life that actually fits who you are, while every decision made purely to satisfy an imagined audience moves you, often invisibly, further away from that same life. Over months and years, these small directional differences compound into dramatically different outcomes. The person who consistently chooses authenticity over approval ends up, gradually and then unmistakably, living a life that reflects their actual values, their actual interests, their actual priorities, while the person who continues optimizing for external validation ends up, often to their own surprise and disappointment, much later, having built an entire life around satisfying an audience that was never actually paying as much attention as they assumed, an audience that, as established earlier in this book, was mostly preoccupied with managing its own version of this exact same fear. There is one more dimension of this shift worth naming directly, because it often surprises people the most, and that is the change in how you experience solitude. For someone deeply entrenched in approval-seeking patterns, time alone can feel oddly uncomfortable, almost aimless, because so much of their internal activity has been organized around the presence, real or imagined, of an audience. Without that audience to perform for, even briefly, there can be an unsettling quiet, a sense of not quite knowing what to do with yourself when no one is there to react. As the shift described throughout this book takes hold, that discomfort tends to transform into something closer to genuine ease. Solitude stops feeling like an absence of validation and starts feeling like an absence of performance, which, once you have practiced enough authenticity, even in the presence of others, becomes simply a continuation of how you already are, rather than a jarring contrast to it. People who have done this work often describe their alone time becoming some of the most valuable time in their week, not because they have become isolated or withdrawn from others, but because it is in solitude that the authentic self, no longer needing to be managed or presented, gets the clearest, most uninterrupted expression. This does not mean connection with others becomes less important. If anything, the opposite tends to be true, because a person who is genuinely comfortable with themselves in solitude brings a different quality of presence into their relationships, one that is not quietly seeking reassurance or validation from every interaction, but is simply fully there, available for genuine connection, rather than distracted by an ongoing internal performance review. This is worth watching for as a marker of your own progress. The more comfortable and genuinely enjoyable your own company becomes, the more evidence you have that your sense of self has successfully migrated from something dependent on an audience to something that exists reliably and pleasantly on its own. Chapter 10. The life that was waiting for you. Everything in this book has led toward a single, simple, and yet genuinely difficult shift: the transfer of authority over your own life from an external, largely imagined audience back to yourself, where it belonged the entire time. This is not a shift that completes itself in a single sitting, no matter how thoroughly you understand the concepts covered here. It is a practice one that will require ongoing attention, particularly in moments of stress or uncertainty, when the ancient alarm system, wired so deeply into your biology, reasserts itself and tries to pull you back into old patterns of managing, softening, and performing. This is not a sign of failure when it happens. It is simply what it looks like to be a human being with a nervous system that took years to build its current patterns and will take sustained, patient effort to meaningfully change. The goal was never to arrive at a permanent state of complete indifference to every opinion anyone ever holds about you. That would not be freedom. It would be a different kind of disconnection, a loss of the very empathy and social awareness that makes relationships meaningful in the first place. The actual goal, the one this entire book has been building toward, is discernment. The ability to distinguish between feedback that genuinely matters from people whose judgment you respect and whose insight can help you grow, and the reflexive, undifferentiated fear of judgment from everyone, everywhere, at all times, regardless of whether their opinion has any real bearing on your life or values. Once you can make that distinction reliably, you gain something far more valuable than simple confidence. You gain the ability to choose, deliberately and consciously, whose input actually deserves a seat at your table, rather than allowing every voice, remembered or imagined, past or present, invited or not, equal and unquestioned authority over your decisions. It is worth revisiting, one final time, the full arc of what has been covered across these chapters, because seeing the shape of the whole journey often clarifies the path forward more than any single piece viewed in isolation. It began with understanding that the fear of judgment is not a personal flaw, but an ancient survival mechanism, one that fires constantly in a modern world it was never designed for. From there, the cost of living inside that fear was made explicit. The small, quiet surrenders that accumulate over years into a life shaped more by an imagined audience than by genuine preference. Then came the spotlight effect, the recognition that the audience you have been performing for is far smaller, far less attentive, and far less invested than your own mind has convinced you it is. From there, the work turned inward, toward the origin of the pattern itself, tracing the conditioning back to its earliest roots, and identifying the specific traps, the approval loop, the comparison trap, and the silence trap, that keep the pattern running long after its original usefulness has expired. With that understanding in place, the work shifted toward construction rather than demolition, redefining confidence not as the absence of fear, but as the willingness to act despite it, building daily practices designed to generate new evidence for a nervous system still operating on outdated information, and finally constructing an identity anchored in genuine values rather than borrowed approval, a foundation stable enough to withstand disagreement, criticism, and the ordinary friction of being a person among other people. Each of these pieces builds on the one before it, and each remains available to you, not as a single reading to be completed and set aside, but as a framework to return to whenever the old patterns reassert themselves, which they will. Because that is simply the nature of deeply wired biological programming, meeting the slower, more deliberate process of conscious change. Think back to where this book began, to that version of you who only fully exists when no one else is watching, the one who dances freely, laughs without measuring the sound, speaks honestly without running every sentence through a filter first. That version was never a fantasy you had to build from nothing. It was, and still is, who you actually are beneath the accumulated layers of performance, conditioning, and inherited fear that this book has spent its chapters carefully working to dissolve. The work ahead of you now is not to become someone new. It is to keep clearing away what was never truly yours to begin with. The borrowed voices, the outdated alarms, the traps disguised as reasonableness, until what remains is simply, finally, undeniably you. This will not always feel comfortable. Growth rarely does. There will be moments, even after everything covered in this book, where the old fear returns, where you catch yourself softening an opinion or hesitating before an honest word. And in those moments, the most useful thing you can do is not to judge yourself harshly for the relapse, but to simply notice it, gently redirect, and continue. Progress here is not linear, and it does not need to be perfect to be real. Every single time you choose your own honest values over an imagined audience's approval, no matter how small the moment, you are casting a vote for the kind of person you are becoming, and votes, cast consistently enough over time, eventually determine the outcome. The life that was waiting for you, the one where you speak honestly, pursue what genuinely interests you, and stop editing yourself down to fit an audience that was mostly imagined all along, is not somewhere far in the future, contingent on becoming a different, braver version of yourself. First, it is available to you starting with your very next decision, the next moment you choose alignment with your own values, over the endless, exhausting performance for a spotlight that, as you now understand clearly, was never really shining as brightly as you believed. The choice, as it always has been, is yours. Before this ends, one final thought deserves to be said plainly. Because it is easy, after so many chapters of careful analysis, to lose sight of the simplest and most important truth underneath all of it. You were never actually broken. You were never a person who simply lacks confidence, who is just naturally anxious, who was somehow built without the capacity to live boldly and honestly. What you had was a nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do, protecting you from social exclusion in the only way it knew how, using tools built for a world that no longer exists in the same form. There is nothing shameful in that. It is simply the inheritance of being human, shared by every single person who has ever felt the sting of imagined judgment, which is to say, shared by every person who has ever lived. The work described in this book is not about fixing a defect. It is about updating a system that served its original purpose well and now needs conscious, deliberate revision to serve you properly in the actual life you are living today. Give yourself the same patience you would offer anyone else undertaking a genuinely difficult, worthwhile change. There will be setbacks. There will be days the old fear feels as loud as it ever did. None of that erases the progress being made underneath the surface, in the slow, quiet accumulation of small choices made in alignment with who you actually are rather than who you believed you needed to be for an audience that, as you now understand deeply, was never watching quite as closely as it felt. Somewhere ahead of you is a version of your life fuller, freer, and more honestly yours than the one you have been living. Not because circumstances need to change first, not because you need permission from anyone, but because the only thing that was ever truly standing between you and that life was the belief that someone else's opinion mattered more than your own. That belief, examined closely enough, does not survive scrutiny. And once it falls away, what remains is simply you, finally free to begin. Chapter 11. Boundaries without guilt. One of the clearest signs that the old pattern of approval seeking still holds significant power over your life is the presence of guilt every time you set a boundary. If saying no to a request, declining an invitation, or asking someone to change a behavior that affects you leaves you feeling as though you have done something wrong, even when the boundary itself was entirely reasonable, this is a direct signal that your sense of worth is still tangled up with other people's comfort, rather than anchored in your own values. This connects directly back to everything established in the earlier chapters of this book, because a boundary is, at its core, one of the clearest possible tests of whether your identity has genuinely shifted toward internal values, or whether it remains, despite intellectual understanding, still anchored primarily in external approval. It is one thing to understand, in the abstract, that your worth does not depend on universal approval. It is another thing entirely to hold that understanding steady in the specific, immediate moment when someone you care about reacts with visible disappointment to a limit you have just set. Boundaries function almost like a pressure test for every principle covered so far, revealing with unusual clarity exactly how much old programming remains active beneath the level of conscious belief. Boundaries are not acts of aggression, and they are not selfish impositions on the people around you. A boundary is simply an honest communication of what you need in order to remain healthy, respected, and functional within a relationship, and honest communication of this kind is one of the most fundamental requirements of any relationship that is going to last and remain genuine over time. The discomfort that arises when setting a boundary is almost never a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is, far more often, a sign that you are doing something unfamiliar, something the old pattern trained you to avoid, because unfamiliar territory, particularly territory that risks another person's disapproval, was flagged by the ancient alarm system as dangerous. This means the guilt you feel when setting a boundary is frequently not moral guilt at all, the kind that arises when you have genuinely wronged someone. It is anticipatory guilt, a preemptive punishment your own mind delivers in advance of a disapproval that may not even materialize. And even if it does materialize, does not actually mean the boundary itself was wrong. Learning to separate these two forms of guilt, the moral kind that deserves your attention and the anticipatory kind that is simply an old alarm firing without cause, is an essential skill for anyone doing this work seriously. Because without that distinction, you will continue treating every uncomfortable feeling as proof of wrongdoing, which will quietly sabotage your ability to maintain boundaries, even after you have intellectually understood why they matter. There is also a common misconception that setting boundaries will damage or end relationships. And while it is true that some relationships cannot survive a boundary, it is worth examining honestly what that actually reveals. A relationship that only functions because one person continuously suppresses their own needs in order to avoid the other person's disapproval was never a fully healthy relationship to begin with, regardless of how pleasant it may have felt on the surface. Genuine, resilient relationships, the kind actually worth investing in long-term, can withstand a reasonable boundary. They may require an adjustment period, an uncomfortable conversation, some renegotiation of expectations, but they do not collapse entirely simply because one person expressed an honest need. If a relationship does end, specifically because you introduced a reasonable boundary, this is difficult in the moment, but it is also valuable information delivered earlier rather than later, sparing you years of continued suppression in a dynamic that was never going to accommodate the real you regardless of when the boundary was finally introduced. Practically speaking, boundaries are most effective when they are stated clearly, without excessive justification or over-explanation, because over-explaining is often itself a symptom of the approval-seeking pattern, an unconscious attempt to make the boundary so airtight and reasonable-sounding that the other person cannot possibly object. A boundary does not require a defense. It requires only clarity. Stating your need plainly, without a lengthy preamble of apologies and justifications, communicates something important beyond the content of the boundary itself. It communicates that you consider your own needs legitimate without requiring external permission to consider them so, which is, in essence, the entire foundation this book has been building toward from its opening pages. There is a particular category of boundary worth addressing specifically, because it tends to generate more guilt than almost any other. And that is the boundary set with someone you love, someone whose good opinion genuinely matters to you, and whose disappointment, unlike the incidental disapproval of a stranger, carries real emotional weight. It is important to be clear that the presence of love does not eliminate the need for boundaries. It actually makes them more important, because unaddressed resentment, the kind that accumulates when needs go unspoken indefinitely in the name of preserving harmony, tends to do far more damage to a close relationship over time than the temporary discomfort of an honest boundary ever could. Loving someone does not require the erasure of your own needs on their behalf, and a relationship that genuinely depends on that erasure is not actually being protected by your silence. It is simply having its underlying problems postponed and compounded for a later date, one that usually arrives eventually in a far less manageable form than if the boundary had been addressed honestly from the start. It is worth addressing, too, the specific fear that often accompanies boundary setting in close relationships, the fear of being labeled selfish, difficult, or unkind, simply for stating a need clearly. This label, when it comes, deserves examination rather than automatic acceptance, because there is an important difference between genuine selfishness, which involves disregarding others' legitimate needs entirely in favor of your own, and healthy boundary setting, which simply involves including your own legitimate needs in a conversation that had previously excluded them. Someone accustomed to your unconditional accommodation may initially experience any boundary as a loss, and may describe that loss using language like selfish or difficult, not because the boundary was actually unreasonable, but because they are grieving the disappearance of a dynamic that, however comfortable it was for them, was never sustainable or fair to you in the first place. Recognizing this dynamic for what it is allows you to hold your boundary with compassion for the other person's adjustment period, without mistaking their initial discomfort for proof that you have done something wrong. A boundary that is met with genuine, sustained hostility from someone who refuses to ever adjust to it over time is telling you something important about that relationship, but a boundary that is initially met with mild discomfort, followed by eventual accommodation, is simply telling you that the relationship is healthy enough to absorb an honest need, which is exactly the kind of relationship worth investing your energy into over the long term. Chapter 12. Learning whose opinion actually counts. A crucial distinction that separates a mature relationship with other people's opinions from a purely defensive rejection of all feedback is the ability to accurately sort the voices around you into categories that deserve different levels of attention. Treating every opinion as equally irrelevant is not actually freedom. It is simply a different, less obvious version of the same undifferentiated reactivity that characterized the original problem, except now everything is dismissed instead of everything being obeyed. Genuine discernment requires building a working framework for deciding, with some consistency, whose input genuinely deserves consideration, and whose input can be acknowledged and released without further processing. This kind of discernment is not something most people are ever explicitly taught, which is part of why so many otherwise thoughtful, intelligent people continue treating every voice around them as though it carries identical authority, simply because no one ever handed them a framework for telling the difference. Without such a framework, the default setting tends toward one of two equally unhelpful extremes. Either every opinion is absorbed with equal weight, leaving you perpetually overwhelmed and pulled in a dozen directions by a dozen competing voices, or, in an overcorrection born from exhaustion with the first extreme, every opinion is dismissed equally, leaving you isolated from genuinely valuable input simply because you have stopped distinguishing it from noise. The framework offered in this chapter exists specifically to avoid both extremes, giving you a deliberate, repeatable method for sorting signal from noise, rather than leaving that sorting process to chance or to whichever voice happens to be loudest or most recent. The first category worth identifying is what might be called earned authority. People who have demonstrated, through relevant experience, expertise, or a track record of genuinely caring about your well-being, that their perspective carries real informational value on a specific topic. A mentor with direct experience in a field you are entering. A close friend who has consistently shown honest, well-intentioned feedback over years. A professional whose specific expertise applies directly to the decision at hand. These are voices worth genuinely weighing because their input is grounded in something beyond a passing, uninvested reaction. This does not mean their opinion should automatically override your own judgment, but it does mean their feedback deserves real consideration rather than the same reflexive dismissal you might reasonably apply to a stranger's passing comment. The second category is what might be called incidental opinion. The reactions of people who have no particular expertise relevant to the situation, no long-term investment in your well-being, and no meaningful stake in the outcome of your decision. This includes most strangers, most acquaintances, most of the anonymous or semi-anonymous commentary that circulates in public and digital spaces. Incidental opinion is worth noting, occasionally worth reflecting on if a pattern emerges across many independent sources. But it does not deserve the same weight as earned authority, and treating it as though it does is one of the most common reasons people remain trapped in exhausting cycles of trying to satisfy an audience that has no genuine stake in their outcome at all. The third category, and often the most difficult to correctly identify, is what might be called inherited authority. The opinions of people from your past, parents, former teachers, old authority figures, whose voices still carry weight in your internal decision-making process, not because of their current relevance to your life, but because of the power they held over you at an earlier, more formative stage. This category deserves particular scrutiny because it is easy to mistake the intensity of an internal reaction for evidence of the opinion's actual importance, when in reality the intensity is often just a holdover from a time when that person's approval genuinely did control significant aspects of your safety and well-being. A useful practice when you notice yourself reacting intensely to a piece of feedback, is to pause and honestly ask which category it actually belongs to. Is this earned authority, a person with real, current relevance and genuine investment in your well-being? Is this incidental opinion a reaction from someone with no particular stake or expertise? Or is this inherited authority an old voice from your past, claiming a level of current relevance it may no longer actually possess? This simple act of sorting, practiced consistently, prevents the common trap of granting every piece of feedback identical weight, regardless of its actual source or relevance, and instead allows you to build a genuinely thoughtful, selective relationship with input from others, one where you remain open to what actually helps you grow, while no longer being at the mercy of every passing reaction from people whose opinion, upon honest examination, was never actually as consequential as it felt in the moment. It is worth adding a fourth, smaller category to this framework, one that is easy to overlook: opinions rooted in someone else's fear, rather than in any genuine assessment of your situation. Sometimes the people closest to you will discourage a choice, not because they have carefully evaluated it and found it lacking, but because your choice reminds them, consciously or not, of a risk they themselves were once too afraid to take, or a path they abandoned and have not fully made peace with. Their caution, however sincerely delivered, may say considerably more about their own unresolved history than it says about the actual merits of your decision. Recognizing this pattern, when it applies, allows you to receive their concern with compassion for what it represents in them, without automatically absorbing it as an accurate verdict on your own choice. It is worth building a simple, practical habit around this entire framework, something you can apply quickly in the moment rather than only in careful, unhurried reflection. When you notice a piece of feedback landing with more emotional weight than the situation seems to warrant, try asking a short series of questions in sequence. Does this person have direct, relevant experience with what I am facing? Have they demonstrated, over time, that they are invested in my actual well-being, rather than simply reacting from their own comfort or discomfort? Is any part of this reaction possibly rooted in their own history, rather than an honest assessment of my situation? And finally, if a stranger with no relationship to me said the exact same words, would I give them anywhere near this much weight? That last question in particular tends to be clarifying, because it strips away the emotional charge that comes purely from familiarity and forces an honest look at whether the content of the feedback, on its own merits, actually justifies the reaction it produced in you. Over time, running feedback through this kind of quick, internal filter becomes second nature, and you find yourself far less frequently derailed by opinions that, once properly categorized, simply did not carry the weight your initial emotional reaction assigned to them. Chapter 13. The Digital Amplifier. Everything covered so far about the ancient roots of approval seeking, the spotlight effect, and the traps that sustain the pattern, existed long before modern technology, but it would be incomplete to discuss this topic without addressing how significantly digital life has amplified nearly every mechanism already described. This amplification deserves careful attention specifically because it operates on a generation, and increasingly on every generation regardless of age, that spends a historically unprecedented number of hours each day inside environments explicitly engineered around the mechanics of approval. It is not an exaggeration to say that many people now interact more frequently in raw quantity with a quantified approval metric than with unmediated, face-to-face human connection, and a mechanism this pervasive cannot be treated as a minor footnote to the broader subject of this book. It deserves to be understood on its own terms, as a distinct and powerful force actively shaping the very patterns every previous chapter has worked to dismantle. Social platforms, by their basic design, transform what used to be an occasional, limited source of social comparison into a constant, nearly infinite one. In earlier eras, your comparison pool was limited to the people you actually encountered in your daily life, a genuinely small sample of humanity relative to the billions of people alive at any given time. Today, a single scroll through a feed exposes you to curated highlights from thousands of lives simultaneously, each one selectively presented to appear more successful, more attractive, more accomplished than the messy, complicated reality behind it. This creates a fundamentally distorted comparison environment because you are comparing your full, unfiltered internal experience, including every doubt, struggle, and ordinary day, against other people's carefully edited highlight reels. A comparison that is mathematically guaranteed to leave you feeling behind no matter how well your actual life is going. Beyond the comparison distortion, these platforms also introduce a new and historically unprecedented phenomenon: the quantification of approval itself. Likes, comments, shares, and followers convert what used to be a vague, immeasurable social instinct into a precise, visible number, updated in real time, creating a feedback loop that is engineered, quite deliberately, to be maximally engaging and, as a direct consequence, maximally addictive. Every post becomes a small experiment in audience approval, and the dopamine response tied to a strong reaction reinforces the exact same approval loop described earlier in this book, except now the loop can be triggered dozens or even hundreds of times a day, with a speed and frequency that ancestral social environments never provided, because ancestral environments simply did not offer the same volume of opportunities for public validation and public judgment within a single day. Understanding this amplification matters because it changes the practical application of everything discussed in earlier chapters. The daily practices around pausing, checking, and building internal evidence become significantly more important, not less, in a digital environment specifically engineered to keep the approval loop active and constantly stimulated. It is worth being honest with yourself about the specific role digital platforms play in your own experience of this pattern. Notice, without judgment, how you feel in the minutes after posting something publicly, waiting for a reaction. Notice how a period of low engagement on something you shared affects your mood, your self-assessment, your motivation to continue creating or sharing in the future. These observations are not meant to produce shame about using these platforms, which have genuine value and genuine benefits when used deliberately rather than compulsively. They are meant to build clear, honest awareness of exactly how much authority you have unconsciously handed over to a quantified, publicly visible approval metric, because awareness of that authority is the necessary first step toward reclaiming it. Some people find it useful as part of this broader work, to deliberately create without an audience for a period of time, writing, making, or pursuing something specifically without ever sharing it publicly, purely to reconnect with the intrinsic satisfaction of the activity itself, separate entirely from any external validation. This practice, uncomfortable at first for anyone accustomed to measuring value through public reaction, often reveals just how much of the enjoyment previously attributed to the activity itself was actually coming from the anticipated approval surrounding it, and how much genuine, sustainable satisfaction remains once that external measurement is removed entirely from the equation. There is one more consequence of this digital amplification worth naming directly, because it is subtle and easy to miss. The way constant visibility can quietly train you to live your experiences with one eye already on how they will be presented before they have even finished happening. A moment that would once have simply been lived, absorbed, and felt gets partially converted in real time into content, into a version of itself shaped for eventual display. This habit, left unexamined, can hollow out the very experiences it claims to celebrate, because a portion of your attention is always diverted toward the anticipated audience rather than remaining fully present in the moment itself. Reclaiming the ability to have an experience purely for its own sake, without immediately packaging it for external consumption, is one of the quieter but more meaningful forms of freedom this work can restore. There is also a specific kind of comparison unique to digital spaces worth naming directly, because it operates slightly differently from the ordinary comparison trap described earlier in this book. In addition to comparing yourself to real people presenting curated versions of their lives, digital environments also expose you to an enormous number of people you will never actually meet, whose full circumstances, resources, and struggles remain entirely invisible to you, reduced down to a single image or a single accomplishment stripped of all context. This creates comparisons that are not simply unflattering. They are fundamentally incomplete, built on a fraction of the information required to make any honest assessment. A person's visible success online might be the product of resources, privilege, timing, or support systems entirely invisible in the post itself, and measuring your own progress, made under your own specific circumstances, against this incomplete picture is not a fair comparison in any meaningful sense. It is simply a distortion that happens to feel like information, because it arrives dressed in the visual language of fact. Recognizing this distortion for what it is, an incomplete fragment rather than a genuine benchmark, is an important part of protecting yourself from a comparison trap that digital platforms have made more frequent, more persistent, and more difficult to escape than any previous generation had to contend with. Chapter 14. Living Boldly in Full View. Everything discussed throughout this book eventually arrives at a single practical question. What would you actually do? Who would you actually become if the fear of judgment stopped functioning as the deciding factor in your choices? This is worth sitting with directly, because abstract understanding of the mechanisms behind approval seeking means little if it never translates into concrete, lived changes in how you actually move through your days. It can be useful to picture this question not as a single, sweeping decision, but as a series of specific forks you will actually encounter, often within the very near future, sometimes within the coming days. Somewhere ahead of you is a conversation you have been avoiding, a piece of work you have been sitting on rather than sharing. A request you have been meaning to make but keep postponing, a version of your appearance or your opinions or your interests you have been quietly holding back in favor of something more universally acceptable. These are not hypothetical future tests of your growth. They are the actual, immediate proving ground where everything discussed across this book either takes root in your real life or remains a pleasant but ultimately inert set of ideas you enjoyed listening to, and then set aside unchanged. The difference between those two outcomes is not intelligence, and it is not even primarily courage in the dramatic sense the word often implies. It is simply repetition, the willingness to apply the pause and check practice, the willingness to act despite the presence of fear, rather than waiting for its absence, applied specifically and deliberately to the actual forks in front of you, rather than to a vague, general intention to someday be bolder. Consider the goals you have quietly set aside, not because they were impossible, but because pursuing them publicly carried the risk of visible failure, of judgment from people who might question the attempt, mock the ambition, or simply witness you falling short of something you dared to try. Consider the honest conversations you have avoided, not because you lacked the words, but because the potential discomfort of the other person's reaction felt like a risk not worth taking. Consider the parts of your personality, your sense of humor, your particular passions, your unconventional opinions that you have quietly dimmed down to a more palatable, less distinctive version in order to avoid standing out in ways that might invite scrutiny. Living boldly, in the context of everything covered in this book, does not mean becoming reckless or indifferent to genuine consequences. It means recalibrating your relationship with risk, specifically around social judgment, recognizing that the perceived danger of embarrassment, of visible failure, of standing out, has been consistently overestimated by an ancient alarm system that cannot distinguish between actual danger and a merely uncomfortable social moment. Once that recalibration genuinely takes hold, the risk calculus around pursuing ambitious goals, having honest conversations, and expressing your full personality shifts considerably because the primary deterrent, an inflated fear of judgment, no longer carries the same weight it once did in your decision-making process. It is worth being specific about what living boldly actually looks like in practice, because the phrase can otherwise remain a vague, inspirational abstraction rather than something actionable. It looks like sharing work before it feels fully ready, because waiting for perfect readiness, as discussed earlier in this book, is often simply another disguised form of the silence trap. It looks like asking directly for what you want, whether that is a raise, an opportunity, a specific kind of support from someone you love, rather than hoping it will be noticed and offered without you ever having to risk the vulnerability of a direct request. It looks like admitting when you don't know something, rather than performing a confidence you don't actually feel purely to avoid the discomfort of appearing uncertain. It looks like pursuing an unconventional path, whether in career, relationships, or lifestyle, even when it invites questions or skepticism from people who expected something more familiar and legible. Each of these actions carries a small, real risk of judgment, and none of this book's teaching suggests that risk will disappear entirely. What changes is your relationship to that risk, your willingness to act despite its presence, informed by the accurate understanding, built across every previous chapter, that the actual cost of judgment is almost always smaller, more survivable, and more temporary than the ancient alarm system predicts, while the cost of continued silence, continued shrinking, continued performance compounds quietly and permanently across the entire span of a life that only happens once. There is a particular kind of regret worth naming here, because it tends to surface later in life with far more weight than the temporary sting of an embarrassing moment ever carries. This is the regret of the unattempted, the goal never pursued, the honest word never spoken, the unconventional path never taken, simply because the fear of how it might look outweighed, in the moment of decision, the value of the attempt itself. People rarely look back with lasting pain over an attempt that did not succeed. They look back, far more often and far more painfully, on the attempts they never allowed themselves to make. Keeping this asymmetry in view, that the risk of trying and being judged is almost always smaller and more temporary than the risk of a lifetime spent wondering, is one of the most reliable tools for tipping a hesitant decision toward boldness rather than retreat. It is also worth addressing the specific fear of appearing arrogant or overconfident, because this particular fear tends to keep many genuinely capable people from pursuing bold goals visibly, out of concern that ambition itself will be read as an unattractive character flaw rather than simply a reasonable pursuit of something meaningful. This fear deserves direct examination, because in most cases, the discomfort of appearing overly ambitious says far more about a cultural discomfort with visible ambition than it says about any actual flaw in the person pursuing their goals openly. There is a meaningful difference between arrogance, which involves dismissing others or claiming superiority, and simply being visibly, unapologetically engaged in pursuing something that matters to you. Most people, when they examine this honestly, discover that what they feared would look like arrogance actually reads to observers as something closer to admirable commitment, and that the handful of people who do judge visible ambition harshly are very often working through their own complicated relationship with unpursued goals of their own, which returns directly to the earlier point about opinions rooted in someone else's fear rather than an honest assessment of your situation. Chapter 15. The person you were always meant to become. This is the final chapter, and it is worth using it not to introduce new material, but to consolidate everything that has come before into a single, coherent understanding you can carry forward long after this specific listening experience has ended. You began this book with an accurate diagnosis. A version of yourself exists that only fully emerges in private, unguarded moments, free from the performance that governs so much of daily life. Across these 15 chapters, the goal has never been to manufacture a new personality or to convince you to become someone louder, bolder, or more externally confident than you naturally are. The goal has been considerably more modest and, at the same time, considerably more profound. To remove the accumulated layers of conditioning, fear, and inherited judgment standing between who you actually are and how you actually show up in the world, so that the gap between those two things narrows until it eventually disappears. This work does not end with the final sentence of this book. It continues in the small, ordinary decisions of your next ordinary day. In the moment you choose to voice an honest opinion instead of a diplomatically edited one, in the boundary you set without an accompanying apology, in the goal you pursue visibly despite the possibility of visible failure, in the quiet, private moments where you choose to trust your own judgment over an imagined committee's verdict. None of these individual moments will feel monumental in isolation. That is exactly how lasting change actually works. Not through a single dramatic transformation, but through the patient, repeated accumulation of small, consistent choices, each one a vote for the person you are deliberately choosing to become, rather than the person conditioning once shaped you into being. Remember, as you move forward from here, that the fear you have felt around judgment was never evidence of weakness. It was evidence of a functioning nervous system doing exactly what evolution built it to do, protecting you from social exclusion, using tools designed for a world that no longer exists in the same form. You are not fighting against a personal flaw. You are consciously, deliberately updating an ancient system to better serve the actual life you are living now. A life that, for the overwhelming majority of the judgments and rejections you fear, carries far less real danger than your body has been trained to assume. This update does not happen once and remain permanently fixed. It is maintained through ongoing practice, through the daily habits described in earlier chapters, through the continued patient work of noticing old patterns and choosing, again and again, a different response. There will be setbacks along the way, moments where the old fear reasserts itself with surprising force, and those moments do not undo the progress you have made. They are simply part of the actual, non-linear texture of meaningful change. What matters most, in the end, is not achieving some permanent, flawless state of total indifference to every opinion, but building a life increasingly governed by your own honest values, rather than an audience that was, from the very beginning of this book, never watching quite as closely or judging quite as harshly as your mind had convinced you it was. Carry this with you as the closing thought of everything you have just listened to. Somewhere ahead of you is a version of your life fuller, freer, and more honestly yours than the one you have been living. Not because circumstances need to change first, not because you need permission from anyone, but because the only thing that was ever truly standing between you and that life was the belief that someone else's opinion mattered more than your own. That belief, examined closely enough across these 15 chapters, does not survive scrutiny. And once it falls away, what remains is simply you, finally free to begin. Before closing entirely, it is worth offering one last, practical anchor you can return to at any point in the future. Whenever the old patterns resurface and the work of these 15 chapters starts to feel distant or difficult to access, that anchor is a single question, simple enough to ask in any moment, no matter how much time has passed since you first heard it here. When facing a decision clouded by fear of judgment, ask yourself plainly, what would I choose right now if I fully trusted my own judgment and fully believed the people around me were, on balance, far less invested in my choices than my anxiety is currently suggesting? This question will not eliminate the fear instantly, and it was never meant to. What it does is create a small but meaningful gap between the automatic, fear-driven response and the response that actually reflects your values. And in that gap, real choice becomes possible again. Every chapter of this book has ultimately been an attempt to widen that gap, to slow down a process that used to happen entirely on autopilot, and to hand the final decision back to the part of you capable of weighing evidence, values, and genuine priorities. Rather than leaving it entirely in the hands of an ancient alarm system, reacting to a threat that, in the vast majority of modern situations was never actually there. Think, too, about the specific people in your life who would benefit from watching you live this way, openly, honestly, without the constant management and self-editing that has quietly shaped so much of your life until now. Children learn far more from what they observe than from what they are told. And if there are young people in your life watching you set an honest boundary, pursue a goal despite visible risk, or simply speak your genuine opinion, without excessive hedging, teaches them something about their own future possibilities that no direct instruction could ever fully replicate. The same is true for friends and peers who may be quietly struggling with the exact same patterns described throughout this book, watching for permission, whether they realize it or not, from someone in their life willing to go first. There is a kind of quiet, generous influence available to anyone doing this work seriously and visibly, an influence that extends well beyond your own individual freedom and into the lives of everyone who witnesses what becomes possible once a person stops outsourcing their worth to an audience that was never as engaged, as attentive, or as invested as the fear had always suggested. As this book comes to a close, resist the temptation to treat its ending as the completion of the work itself. What you have gained across these 15 chapters is not a finished transformation, but a clear, thorough map, one detailed enough to guide you through the actual terrain of this change for as long as you continue walking it. Maps are only useful when they are used, revisited, and applied to the real, specific, sometimes messy decisions of an actual life, not simply understood once and set aside. Return to these ideas whenever you need to. Revisit the framework for sorting whose opinion actually counts whenever a piece of feedback lands harder than it should. Revisit the reminder that your ancient alarm system cannot distinguish real danger from mere discomfort whenever fear starts making your decisions for you. Revisit the simple, grounding truth that the audience you have spent so much of your life performing for was, in nearly every case that actually mattered, far smaller, far less attentive, and far less permanent than it ever felt in the moment. This is not the end of the work. It is the beginning of a life finally lived on your own terms, one honest choice at a time. For as long as you choose to keep making them,